All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to HistoryFix's behind the scenes live stream for this week. This is our third episode up and going, and we've done the first two with documentary directors. Today we're going to move over to the narrative. Of course, with HistoryFix, we say, hey, look, history is stories. Sometimes you want a documentary, sometimes you just want a movie to sit back and relax with, and that's where we're going to be tonight, welcoming my good friend and director, Tim Troy, to the show. Thanks for coming out, Tim.
Hi, Will, and hi to everybody back home.
Yeah,
happy to be here.
Great. Well, a little bit of administrative. What is behind the scenes? This is a chance for you to interact with directors, producers, actors. Everybody always asks questions about what it's like to be in movies, and here we are in history and able to see and able to chat and have some conversation. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Tim, talk to me a little bit about your show, Hold My Horse.
Hold My Horse is a short film that we produced in 2017. It is about a general named Israel Richardson who had a habit of walking around in civilian clothes. And there's a number of stories about him doing this and sort of playing tricks or the confusion that it would cause amongst some of the lower ranking members of the Army, because there would be frequent cases of mistaken identity where people didn't realize exactly who he was unless they'd already been familiar with him.
Well, great. And that's the story we're going to talk about tonight. Let's spin back and let's talk about you a little bit, and we'll come back to the story. Tell us a little bit about yourself as a storyteller.
So I have lived in Chicago for a long time, and I have been, following a path of storytelling pretty much since I was a kid. I joke that I used to be the kid that would take his action figures and create elaborate backstories for them. So it took me 3 hours to play, Ninja Turtles or something, because I had to have all the backstory created. I went to film school at Columbia College Chicago and pursued that in terms of directing, and that got me into the film business, which is where I still make my money when we're not on strike.
Well, not on strike. Let's say that both of us work in the film industry. Sure. And okay, guys, we're just going to go ahead and drop this here. Normally, I'm talking with people bringing stories to us. I helped bring the story to the screen. I produce this show. So where I'm asking a lot of questions, sometimes I'll be batting some ideas out. So feel free to throw the questions. Tim and I spent, 5 years working together on Chicago PD?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so in most of those years with Tim as the dolly grip on the camera team that I was operating on, so we were always around each other. But, Tim, where does the history bug bite you?
The history bug comes from my family. I was junior high and high school. My dad was in a Civil War reenacting group. So I forget the exact number of the regiment he was in, but part of Illinois. And he did that for probably 5 years, maybe almost 10, somewhere in between there. But I got a lot of Civil War information from him, and I just kind of absorb it through osmosis. And then you start to learn the value of history from that. It kind of branched off. I had teachers that were really good, especially in high school. I remember a teacher that really kind of gave you the spark of understanding why history matters and why it can be exciting. And the nice thing is, I think it only takes one teacher or one person, in your life to really fire that up. And I've had a couple. So.
Well, you got a chance here. You can give a shout out to a couple of those teachers if you want, because that's big for a lot of us.
Oh, I'm going to embarrass myself if I try and pull it up, because I can't remember his name off the top of my head now. But I know he taught at Whitney Young, and he loved Napoleon, and you could just see the fire come into his eyes as soon as he started talking about the Napoleon Wars and how that whole arc of history occurred.
And of course, in the Civil War, you're downstream from Napoleon, but still using a lot of the concepts there.
100%.
Yeah, well, let's go to the other side. You can tell a historic story, but we're telling historic movies. Where's the movie bug bite you?
The movie bug, again, came to me very, very young. I was watching movies as far back as I can remember. I grew up on a steady stream of stuff like King Kong and Star Wars and Indiana Jones, all the wonderful movies that 80s kids could rattle off. In terms of professionally, I think it sort of clicked into my brain watching some of the behind-the-scenes documentaries that they started releasing in the early 90s, stuff like Making a Star Wars and the Making of Jurassic Park, where you got to see people manipulating these animatronics or setting up cameras or working the sound and blowing stuff up, and it was like, oh, people do this for a living, right? Like this is a thing that you can do. And once you realize that, and you realize that you can actually do this as a career, then you start to kind of gravitate what you like to do and what you like to do in the movies. And I fell into directing, because I think everybody does when you start. There's the old joke: you go into a film class and everybody raises their hand. Who wants to be a director? 30 hands go up in a 30-person class, and by the end of it, there's 5 or 10 people that still want to do that, but a lot of people have discovered that they actually wanted to shoot, or they actually wanted to edit or write. I never really lost the trick for directing. It seems like I have at least a little bit of an affinity for knowing how to take a script and put it onto a screen.
Great. Well, let's combine the two. You've got history, you've got movie making. How do the two come together for you?
Well, this was the first time for when I did Hold My Horse. I take that back. I did a project in film school that we set in World War II. It was more of a directing exercise. It was you shoot 4 hours in a classroom setting where they have a standing set. And so I brought costumes in, and I got a bunch of drywall I could rip up and scatter across as all the debris from the room. But you can't get too crazy about it, and you can't do you can't make a really immersive film in that situation. I'm proud of that, and I like how it turned out, but it was always a directing exercise. Hold My Horse was the first time I could make a real movie in the history setting, and I really like it, and I want to get back to that because there's something fun about it. You and I will have talked about how history can be a genre. Like you can look at it as a genre, but it's also more than that, right? Like history is a setting. It's got a little touch more because it is real, right? Because when you can do anything with it. You can tell horror stories, you can tell dramas, you can tell comedies. Hold My Horse is a comedy set in a Civil War camp, right? That was part of what tickled me so much about doing this, is that it's a way to spin things that people think they know about and give them a completely different look at it. Right? One of the things that really drew us to telling the story of Hold My Horse was the idea that this is everyday slice of life kind of story in a Civil War camp with Civil War soldiers, because I cannot think of anything else in, at least in wide release, that has ever tackled that part of Civil War life, right? Like the day-to-day things that Civil War soldiers went through, and the fact that these guys were, still humans having fun, even while they were in the midst of this terrible conflict.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this. I'm going to go off order with you, but it's something you and I have shook our heads at and laughed at for a number of years. You made a comedy. Did you set out to make a comedy?
Hold My Horse is funny because, well, it should be. It's a comedy, right? Hold My Horse is interesting, I should say, because we never really knew how to classify it, even when we were sending it out to festivals, right? Like we'd look at it kind of sideways and be like, is this a drama? Is it a comedy? Is it, where do we fit this in? And I think it's because it's a little bit of a couple of different things, right? It comes down to being a morality play. It comes down to be a question of, how do you treat other people? And it's done with some amusement, and it's done with some playfulness. So I think we kind of settled on calling it a comedy, but I wouldn't say that we set out to make it funny, right? I think part of what made it as funny as I hope it is was our choice of casting Patrick Webb, who just has a comic energy to him that is tough to beat. And then the cast around him, like Christian and David Guy, also brings some comedic flavor to it. Chris is very dry, and you get a lot of mileage in comedy out of his reactions. And David also has some really great reactions that I don't think we even knew we were going to get until we were on set.
No, looking at a picture of David and Christian working here together or talking on the sidelines on set, it was just fantastic to work with both of them. Talk a little bit about working with Christian for the show.
I was super excited to do that. Not only because I knew he was a great actor, but it was sort of a growth opportunity for me, because at that point I'd only really made a couple of shorts and only one really seriously at the time. And I'd never worked with any SAG actors before, let alone anybody who, had a role on a TV show. and had been in a bunch of movies. Chris has worked with Michael Mann and all kinds of famous people. So I was a little intimidated at first, but the great thing about working with Chris is that he just puts you at ease right away, because he is very, very down to earth and very laid back. And, I had a phone call with him earlier before we shot the film. And I was like, is there anything I need to know about, how you like to work? And he was like, no, don't worry about me. I am straight ahead. What you see is what you get. And that's 100% true. He was a doll to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about him and Patrick working together. There is a scene near the end of the story, and I'm not going to give away for a spoiler, but I will say there's a scene where there's a couple of scenes where they interact. If you want to talk about the arc between the two and working with them for that.
Yeah, the two of them really ended up playing well off of each other. I think the characterizations that we landed on and that came about partially because of their own personalities and how we leaned into those, really began to work together well. We noticed it after, I think, the first scene, and then it just got better and better as they went on. The idea that Pat has this sort of manic comic energy, we talked about it, me and him, and we almost compared it to like Basil Fawlty from Fawlty Towers, the John Cleese role. And he's got a lot of that like pride and sort of in over his head quality to things without really knowing that he is. He's arrogant, but he's arrogant in a silly way. And Patrick always realized that the joke was on him, right? His character didn't realize it, but he knew it, and so he was able to feed into that. And Chris knew exactly what he had to do. He just had to let the guy give himself enough rope to hang himself. Right. And that's the whole joke basically of the movie. And letting those emotions play across his face is, I think, the trick that Chris has learned best, because he does so much with just a facial expression or just a raise of an eyebrow is all he needs to do to communicate exactly what he's thinking. And I think that's the mark of a really good actor. Like they don't need the dialogue most of the time. They don't even need they don't need any specific direction sometimes. It's all just in the action and in the reaction to the other actors, because they listen to one another.
We see a great moment here. Tim doesn't see the screen you guys are seeing at home, but Tim, I'm showing the shot of Wilson and Richardson inside the tent while getting ready in the morning, and you see the look from Christian coming across to David Guy. Talk with us a little bit about the support people who helped him, David Guy and Dylan Jost, supporting both of our main characters.
Yeah, we had really good supporting characters on this, and again, I credit the actors for really knowing what they had to bring to it and delivering on it. So the support characters in this are how we understand the main characters and their role towards the theme of the story, which is, of course, how you treat other people matters, right? We see that General Richardson treats his subordinates, including who's essentially a servant or an aide, very, very well, like as an equal, in fact, in everything but military rank. And Crowley, who Patrick Webbs plays, does exactly the opposite. He treats everyone like a servant, even his fellow officers of his own same level, right? Like he's condescending to them. He's just rude all around. And that's part of the lesson that gets taught by the end of the movie.
Great. Well, talk to me about where this story comes from. Obviously, we can tell a great historic story, but does this ground itself?
This is almost entirely verbatim from the account from a book by a man named Dan Crotty. You'll have the title of it on the tip of your tongue before I will, but the story essentially came right out of that, and we added little bits and pieces with some other things we learned about Richardson's life. Like, I don't think Wilson, who David Guy played, was actually in the original story, but we knew that he existed from a photo that we have that survives from the war, which I think Will he can probably bring up at some point.
It's up.
And
It's up right now.
yeah, so he was somebody that we were able to add and give, a life to, and hopefully do a good service to by bringing him to life on screen. And we know that the lieutenant existed. We know that this story happened. We don't have a name for him, so we had to invent a name. But again, virtually everything in here was either directly from the account or was, I think, well within the spirit of what we had. Will and I have talked about the concept of barely fiction, which is kind of what we were aiming for with this. Like it's historical fiction, yes, but we want to keep it as close to the reality as we can and still keep the story engaging and interesting.
Well, let me just fill in a little bit of the gaps there, Tim. The account is 4 years campaigning in the Army of the Potomac by Dan Crotty, who is the color sergeant of the 3rd Michigan Infantry. For those of you who are history buffs, they're Red Diamonds. They're part of Phil Kearny's division at this point in time. And the photos that you saw come up, you can search out at the Library of Congress. That pictures Richardson in front of his tent. And we also know from an account about the 2nd Michigan about several self-emancipated enslaved persons who end up with the Richardson's division, and we know at least one stays with. So we didn't have R. Wilson's name, the escaped African-American. We didn't have Lieutenant Crowley's name because Dan Crotty just called him a waif of a lieutenant. Well, Tim, this is someplace you and I bang our heads and sometimes bang our heads against each other. Talk a little bit about the challenges of taking a good historic story and creating the good movie and staying true to it.
Yeah, it's a trick. And it's always tricky because you want to honor the history and you want to honor the reality of it. The problem, as I think anybody that follows history knows, is that history's weird, right? Like it's random, it's unpredictable, and it's almost unbelievable in some ways. Like you sit down and you read accounts sometimes and you're like, there's no way that happened, except that it did, because it's right there in front of you in black and white. And you realize that if you try and put that in a script, it's just too easy, right? There's times where the stories that you would want to tell need actually more conflict. It's weird to think about that, especially in the context of telling stories, say in the Civil War or during World War II or something. But sometimes stuff just goes off without a hitch, and you're like, well, I'm trying to tell a story here. You need the characters to overcome obstacles because that's what makes us care for them, right? You want to see people struggle because I think everybody that watches stories is a little masochistic in that way, right? Like we want to see our characters have to fight for what they want, and they have to grow and persevere over whatever's in their way. And that's how we grow to love them. So you find these historical accounts that sometimes just don't have enough of that. And then you're stuck with this case of, well, okay, it needs to be true, but it also needs to be interesting. The other problem that you run into a lot of times is that stuff just takes too long or too short amount of time, right? Like or it's out of order. Out of order happens a lot when we're reading these stories because you want to see the things happen in sort of a logical progression and something that makes some thematic sense and makes sense for characters to grow. And it doesn't work that way in history. And so that's why you end up with a lot of things shifted around, or, people look at the historical story and they're like, well, that's way more interesting. And it is more interesting in a way, but if you plopped it into a movie, it wouldn't work as well. And you're always working that balance.
Yep. We have a question come in on the line, and anybody listen, if you've got questions, fire them in on the chat. We see them here, and I'll bounce them over. Question for you, Tim. Is there any point in the story you had to take creative liberties? Any examples within Hold My Horse?
We took some creative liberties with the names, obviously. We had to invent those. I think there's a scene which might be my favorite in the movie, which I think we invented pretty much out of whole cloth, other than, like I said, staying within the spirit of it. But there's a scene in which Crowley comes up on a group of soldiers crossing by, and he has to stop them and to get across because he's too important to wait for an extra 2 minutes to let all these people go through. And so he kind of throws Richardson's name around to get everybody to stop. That was a really challenging scene to shoot, and that's part of why I like it so much. But it came off really well in the end product too, and I dug that. But that I'm pretty sure Will can double check me on it, but I don't think that ever existed in any kind of historical story. Yeah, I
Not
think it came up
not
with
that
that.
we ran into that. That was something we needed to add. Speaking of things to add, production and the sets around really do a lot to help people escape and get into the world. And we're just going to pause here before going to the next because, and I'm going to say this: I have a question for you, and I think you can tell me who's asking it. What advice did your favorite AD give you?
Well, my favorite AD, I'm assuming you're talking about Tommy Burke.
That would be where the question came from.
Tommy Burke told me that we need to start with an insert shot. And he's 100% right because it gets you on the board and it makes everybody, once you have a shot in the can, everybody just kind of relaxes a little bit no matter what it is.
Yeah.
So
well, let's do this real quick for those of us not in the trade because we're quickly in the trade here. Tommy is an AD who Tim and I worked with for many years, and an insert shot is a close-up. It could be a hand, it could be a book, it could be something. It's a detail that tells the story, and it's usually a lot easier for a crew to get than, say, a wide shot or two people talking.
Thanks for the question, Tommy. Good to hear from you.
So
I don't know that we actually followed his advice because I'm pretty sure we shot a scene first, and I don't know if we started with an insert shot or not, but his point was true. We had to adjust ourselves on the fly pretty quickly that first day because our schedule was thrown out of whack because our horse trailer for a movie called Hold My Horse had not one, not two, not three, but four flat tires as it was coming in. So we had to change around what we were going to do. We were going to shoot the horse first. We were going to have all the hard stuff out of the way, and that didn't work. So the horses did get there safe and sound, and we clearly have them in the movie. But it took, I think, a solid 6 or 7 hours that first day that we had to completely readjust and do a couple other scenes first.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of getting to location, talk to me about the location. There's wooden buildings with Richardson, and there's not elsewhere. Talk to me about the location and why we did what we did.
Oh, I love that camp that we were in. It's a winter quarters camp that some of the reenactors who actually appear in the movie had built, and it's so critical for this particular film because I think you could easily have gotten lost and confused into where everybody was and who they were and what was going on if we didn't have that visual difference between Richardson's camp, which was set in the winter quarters, and the mobile infantry camp that was set up again by all the living historians in one of the fields really close by. On a technical level, the place we were shooting was a dream because it wasn't but a 2-minute walk from the winter quarters to the field where we set up the other camp. So we were able to go back and forth really, really quickly, which, anybody that works in film knows is a godsend.
Good. Well, let me fire another question. We're starting to get some thrown in here. Robert says, hello, is there something to say about balancing creative license and discrediting real people by altering their personalities or character?
Yeah, that's definitely a trick, right? Like I think, and that's something that I think Will and I are especially careful about when we talk about doing a project. Like we don't want to change who the people were. It sometimes becomes necessary to combine people, and then you get sort of an amalgam. And in that case, I think my instinct would be probably not to give them, the name of one or the other people and make somebody up, just for that very reason, so that we weren't assigning characteristics to somebody that we can't for sure say we had them. But I think if you're going to tell stories about people from history, you don't want to put labels on them that they didn't have or interpret them in ways that you can't be sure is true. And I mean, obviously when you're going through history, it's all up to debate to some degree, right? But I think, if you're going to make a decision about who somebody was, you need to have some kind of support about it in order for people to feel good about the story that they're watching.
Great. Well, before I go back into my questions, another one here. Tarlin says, what scene was the hardest to get how you imagined it translated to the screen?
I'm going to go back to that scene with the column of infantry that Crowley has to stop, if only for the reason that we were a little shy on reenactors that day, and we had to be very creative about how we shot it. You may or may not be able to tell when you watch the movie, but there's only about, what do we have, 12, 15 guys?
I think about 15.
Yeah. And, we had to figure out how to make it look like 100. So we were very creative about the angles we were using. And for the widest shot, like, I wish we had some behind the scenes footage of it, because the poor guys like went in front of the camera and then they went back around and then they had to duck down so they weren't in front of the camera, and then they went back around, and we just looped them so that the line of, rifles would keep going in front of the camera. But it's solving problems like that creatively that is a lot of fun. And it's kind of one of the reasons you like making movies, because, or at least I do, because it's sort of like a big puzzle. And I love putting together puzzles. Making a movie, I've said sometimes making a movie is like making a puzzle where you're cutting the pieces as you go.
I always thought it was like playing chess on a 3-dimensional board.
Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah, so, well, talk to us. I mean, we had a lot of people help there. A lot of living historians came and gave their weekend to make this story come to the screen. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Talk about casting out of living historians, because we have a cast of professionals and we have some roles that are filled by people who aren't in SAG and others by people who aren't actors by trade. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was another opportunity for me to learn some stuff about how to direct, because like I think I said already, this was not, I didn't have a lot of directing experience when I got into this. So I was sort of figuring things out as I went along. And I think anybody who's directing will tell you that you're always figuring things out as you go along, no matter where you are. But it was definitely the case here. Working with people that are not actors, you have some luck of the draw in it, right? Sometimes they're very natural on camera, and we saw that in some of our actors. And then you have others that are a little more shy in front of a camera, and you have to draw it out of them better. One of the things I learned is that you really have to drill down deep into exactly what the character needs, and you have to simplify those directions for actors that are a little more shy, and you just have to get right to the heart of exactly what to tell them so that they're able to do it and able to focus on it. I remember one of the characters was playing a leader on the screen, and I said, you just have to lead, right? That's all you have to do. And that clicked for him.
I'll tell you one thing I think that helped. I think one place living historians helped is we had one actor who is an actor by trade. Ryan, you and I both worked with him quite a bit. And as soon as he got in, he had to command a company. Well, I did with a young officer as a producer, as somebody who's senior and leading. I did with him what I do with a lot of young officers. I paired him up with a really darn good NCO, the living historian who's by his side. I said, look, if you need to make some decisions, chat with him and listen to him.
Yeah, I think, this is a good opportunity to throw out there that Will was a producer on this, and he made this thing happen from beginning to end. Like, it's just, Will's drive put this into, he made it exist. Without Will running this behind the scenes, I never would have been able to get anything done. I never would have been able to focus on the creative stuff, and it wouldn't have been, a 10% of as good as it is without that going on.
Well, thank you, but we split and went different directions. We had a great team with us. Dan Lampkin, as an AD, just made things run and made sure I was dealing with logistics behind the scenes, but Dan was making sure you had what you needed right up at the camera. And so
True.
A lot of great stuff there and two great camera teams. Jameson is the director of photography. But let's talk about a lot of people volunteered and gave their weekend, and I think now's the time where we can say, look, if you want to see this, gang, and you haven't yet, this stream's exclusively on HistoryFix. You can get 20% off the first year by using the code from Civil War Digital Digest, CWDD20, and there's a 7-day free trial. But I'll say this, every minute that this gets watched, money comes back, and that's the way HistoryFix works. When you subscribe and you watch, the time you spend with different projects pays those producers. In our case, we're paying off our bills, but we're also giving money to charity. Everybody gave to work in. And so I said, look, I can take money back for what we've put in to make it happen, but there's no way that I'm going to make money on the backs of other people. That's one of the fights we're having in the film industry right now, quite honestly. And we're not going to do that. So with everybody donating a weekend, what we decided to do is after expenses are paid, and even beforehand, some of the money is already going here, we're splitting the proceeds of this little movie in half. Israel Richardson came into service at historic Fort Wayne, Detroit in 1861. Well, came into Civil War service, and he's mortally wounded at Antietam. There's a nonprofit at the fort, which I used to be on the board of, and we're giving half the proceeds there. And the Save Historic Antietam Foundation, working with Mr. Tom Clements for years, has done great work, both in history out at Antietam, but also in environmentalism. They've replanted thousands of trees to put woods back where they are, and that puts trees back in the world. So we're giving half to where Richardson came in and half to where he sadly left. So just to share with you guys, we'd love to have you take a look at the film. It streams only here, but know that you're going to be able to help do some good by your couple of minutes spent with us as well. So I see some questions coming in. We have Chris Jebb, who is one of the horse owners, saying he's got a big Chickamauga call tonight because there's a huge reenactment coming up the middle of September for the 160th. But his where he says, Timmy says, great work, fellas.
Thank you.
So
Thank
stopped
you,
in and probably stepped out to his call. And Chris, we're glad you got tires back on that trailer. We really appreciate you not stopping and saying, I'm still coming to make this happen. So Tim, let me turn. If we get more questions, we'll come back in here. But I'm near the end of the list of questions, and I always have the same two questions because they have to do, what's one story you've wanted to tell in history that you haven't been able to yet?
We have a couple. You know, I suppose it's not going to be any secret that Will and I kind of talk back and forth about history projects all the time. And there's a couple that we're kicking around. One of them is the story of Julia Wheelock, who is she's not a nurse, but she worked for the Michigan Soldiers Aid Society. Kind of nursing was sort of sideways to what she was doing, side adjacent, I should say. And there's an account from her book that deals with having to overcome all the bureaucracy of the Army in terms of getting injured soldiers cared for. And so she actually goes and kidnaps a group of soldiers and brings them to a hospital and gets them the care they need. And it turns into sort of like almost like a heist movie that we find really interesting. And it would be nice to bring that to life at some point. That seems like it's probably a short film, a longer short. And then there's another story from the Battle of Winchester, the Third Battle of Winchester, where
keep track of them as they go by.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Winchester, Virginia, flipped hands something like 50 or 60 times over the course of the war, and in the final time that the town changed hands, it was mainly due to the efforts of a Quaker woman and we think he was still enslaved at the time, black man, who were able to get information to the Union soldiers. So they weren't officially spies, but they were basically spying for the Union cause. Their names are Rebecca Wright and Thomas Laws, respectively. And that's a story that we haven't quite been able to crack yet, but we think it's one that deserves some spotlight.
Yep. Well, then let me throw the next question I was throw out. What historic area interests you that you haven't worked in yet that you'd like to go to?
World War I. It had a moment in the limelight recently because All Quiet on the Western Front was nominated for an Oscar. Did it win? I don't remember.
I don't remember. 1917 as well.
Yeah. So it's had a little bit of a resurgence lately, probably due to all the, centennial kind of things that's kind of in everybody's brain. But the fact is it hasn't been really well represented on screen other than All Quiet on the Western Front in 1917 and maybe Paths of Glory. Like, once you get past that, there's really not that much that deals with it. And it's such a fascinating conflict that sets up so much of the modern world and sets up World War II. And I think people just forget about it because it tends to be the accounts tend to be like this long slog of people really not making any progress. But I think there's stories to be told in that too. And there's obviously thematic richness to it, like the futility of war and the futility of the efforts that are going into it. So we've got an idea that we're playing with for maybe doing something there as well.
Yeah, look forward to bringing something there, but it's just a chance to keep telling history. Tim, thanks so much for talking about the stuff behind it and for helping let people ask questions. I mean, this has been so far our best attended one, and questions coming to you. So thanks to everybody for coming out this evening. We'll leave you with a chance to take a look at a way to take a discount for HistoryFix. Check out www.historyfix.com and give us a try. Thanks for coming behind the scenes. And Tim, thanks for coming out with us this evening. Really appreciate the time.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Have a great evening, everybody. We will see you next Thursday.